Welcome to The Plunge with Derek Holzer. Joyful t-shirt wearing Derek here today because it is mid-April in the Pacific Northwest, and for the first time in months, we have experienced 4 consecutive days of sunshine without precipitation and temperatures reaching the mid-60s. If you're not from this area, you really don't have any idea how incredibly overwhelming and exciting and energizing this experience can be. After spending 7 to 8 months hoping, looking, glancing, praying for the sign of that wonderful orb at the center of our creation that gives us life, it's here, and I'm loving every minute of it. I don't go to McDonald's, but I do love sunshine. Joining me today is Landon Loftin, teacher at Gravitas, a global extension of the Stony Brook School, a private prep school on Long Island, New York, which has spread virtually through its program Gravitas, for which Landon is a professor. Landon is an Owen Barfield scholar. Landon has served over the course of his career at the intersection of compassion and inspiration. I found him to be a very kind and curious fellow, fond of debate and intellectual sparring, much like the two gentlemen we discuss in today's episode, Owen Barfield and C.S. and their infamous Great War. Landon sheds additional context on that great conversation that went on for quite a while between Lewis and Barfield. But this conversation also provides introduction to something that has not been mentioned heretofore in the Owen Barfield series on The Plunge, and that is Barfield's key role in the founding of the Society for the Protection of Unborn Children. As an attorney and as an advocate for life, Barfield was instrumental in helping to bring that organization, which according to their website is the very first of its kind in the world, into being in the late 60s. I hope you'll enjoy this conversation. I'm so grateful that you've joined, and I'm so thankful to Landon for being willing to take the plunge. Let's dive in. All right, Landon Loftin, it's a pleasure to meet you. I really appreciate you making the time to discuss Owen Barfield with me today. How are you?
I'm doing great, and thank you for having me.
Well, that's wonderful. One of the things I ask everyone who comes on is if you'd be willing to share a little bit about your backstory. How did you find your way to your current vocation, and what kind of things are you energized about pursuing in the days and years to come?
Yeah, well, just briefly about me, I was born in Texas. I grew up in Kansas. I moved to Missouri for college. I studied religion and philosophy, and that sort of set me on a trajectory. My first philosophy class totally changed my life. I loved it so much. And then when I graduated, I got married. My wife and I moved to West Africa for a couple years. We went there to help some friends start a home for girls who had been trafficked on Lake Volta. We stayed there to run the home and take care of the girls for as long as we were needed, but eventually they just didn't need us anymore, so we came back. And I didn't really know what to do after that, so I worked on a master's degree, which I'll tell you about in a little bit. It's sort of what opened up my eyes to Owen Barfield and all that's continually interesting to me about his work. But after completing the master's degree, I think it was like a 7-year stint as a hospital chaplain. That was exciting and rewarding work, but it wears down on you after a while. And I also really wanted to do something that, I have a craving for like intellectual stimulation. And so I got into teaching after I completed my PhD so that I could read books a lot and people would have to listen to me talk about them. And so that's what I do, and I am excited about that. I think it's a lot of fun. I teach for a school called Gravitas. That's a global extension of the Stony Brook School, and I've really been enjoying that for the past few years.
Wonderful. I think I might have encountered one of your colleagues at a George McDonald conference in December.
Okay.
The program sounds familiar to me from that context.
Yeah, it's not unlikely.
Yeah. And could you tell me a little bit about the program, Gravitas?
Sure. Yeah, it's the online extension of the Stony Brook School. So the Stony Brook School is an old, really great private school in Long Island, New York. And for various reasons, they wanted to expand their reach. And so we put that curriculum to online courses and serve students all over the world.
Fascinating. And what are you teaching right now?
A lot of things. That's part of what I like about it. I teach some history courses, European and American history, and some literature, and I teach some Bible courses, all of which are pretty fascinating. I like the opportunity to learn about the things that I'm teaching, and it's great. Like I said, I was a hospital chaplain before, and I found it immensely rewarding, but teaching's really, I think I use the word vocation. Teaching's really my vocation. It's what I enjoy doing.
Well, it's inspiring. It's a little remarkable, given that you spent the time, as you described, in Africa, and then as a hospital chaplain, incredibly intense traumatic, care that you were in the midst of. And how was your own transition from that level of, I don't know what the word is, but it certainly can be dark,
Yes.
right? Not without
Yes.
hope, but yeah, I'm just curious about that as you transition to teaching.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's certainly a relief. Both my work in Ghana and my work as a hospital chaplain, it's like running a marathon. You're not glad when you're doing it, but you're glad that you did it once you've done it.
Yeah.
And that's not true. I enjoyed both of those, each in their own way, immensely, but day to day in both of those roles that I've played, there was a lot of hardship and a lot of things that you don't really know how to make sense of in the moment, and then you spend a long time afterward trying to make sense of them, but then things move on and new challenges arrive and you have to kind of leave it there. So, I mean, to this day, I think that, again, from both my wife and I's work in Ghana and also my work at the hospital, I still come to realizations, why I think or feel a certain way. And I'm like, you know what? I bet it's really connected with these experiences that I had, for better or for worse.
Sure. Yeah.
So,
I imagine you can't encounter that type of work without having some transformation happening in your own life.
certainly, yeah.
Wow, I'm inspired, Landon, already. My next question is, how did you discover Barfield, and what was your first impression of him?
Yeah, so I've been reading C.S. Lewis for as long as I can remember. I mean, as a young kid, I loved the Chronicles of Narnia and the like. And then I was about 16, I think, when my dad gave me Mere Christianity. I read that. I loved it. So I've always been interested in Lewis. So as I told you, I started working on a master's degree, and I decided to write a master's thesis on the role of the imagination in Christian theology and apologetics, with particular reference to C.S. Lewis. And as soon as I started researching, I realized I can't even pretend to credibly present Lewis's views on this matter without learning about this guy, Owen Barfield. And his name was familiar to me because he's mentioned often in Lewis's books, but I hadn't actually read anything by Barfield. So I got a Poetic Diction and started reading it. And at first it was difficult. I wasn't sure what was going on or what he was doing. There were a lot of allusions that at that time I didn't have any reference for. But once I began to get a grasp on the big picture, I was totally enthralled. I always think of the line that Thoreau said, that every man dates a new era in his life from the reading of a great book. And there's a handful of books for me that I just look back and it's like a moment when I'm reading, when I know a new era of my life is opening and it's connected to what I'm learning here, and Poetic Diction was one of those. So yeah, my initial impression was a little bit intimidated and didn't quite understand what was going on. And then I was completely enthralled as soon as I got my feet under me and read as much Barfield as I could. So when I went on to work on a PhD, I knew actually the only reason I did a PhD is because I wanted to carry my research into Barfield forward after finishing my master's. And I thought, well, I might as well get credit for doing it if I'm going to do it anyways. So I enrolled to write some kind of Barfield-related dissertation, which I did. I finished that last year. And after that, I thought that would sort of get it out of my system, that I'd be ready to move on to something else after graduating. But here we are, and I feel like I'm just getting started. So that's how I came to have my interest, and I think I've got one, maybe two more books about Barfield in me.
Fascinating. And did you study for the master's and the doctoral work in the same institution or different schools?
The master's was Houston Christian University, and my PhD was at Faulkner University.
Okay. And where is Faulkner located?
It's in Alabama.
Ah, I see. Where are you located? I assumed you were in New York because of the school, but you might not be.
Yeah, so we're not quite across the continent from each other, but still longer than I'd want to drive. I'm in Missouri, Bolivar, Missouri right now.
Okay. Okay. Wonderful. I have good friends in St. Louis. I don't know how
Yeah,
close that is to you, but
3.5 hours, but
okay. Yeah.
yeah.
Well, gosh, I have so many questions. I want to ask you about what's next for your books, but I'll stick to my script, as it were. It seems to me that you likely have quite a bit of insight to Lewis and Barfield's Great War, as it's been styled, and I want to talk about that. But before we do, there was something you had mentioned in our correspondence prior to this conversation regarding Barfield's involvement in the founding of the Society for the Protection of Unborn Children. And I had never heard of that, and so I'm curious if you could tell us about it and his role and its importance today.
Yeah, it's a fact it's just sort of mentioned a couple times in the one major biography of Barfield, and isn't presented as being something of much importance. But to me, I mean, this is a really significant biographical fact. So let me back up a little bit. The SPUC, and it stands for the Society for the Protection of Unborn Children, and they claim, this is from their website, they say that they're the first group formed anywhere in the world to campaign against legalized abortion. And moreover, they're involved in other, what we would just loosely call pro-life causes, euthanasia and these other issues that people have debates about. And but they claim to be the oldest pro-life campaigning and educational organization in the world. So to me, biographically, it's really interesting that Barfield was one of 15 founding members of that organization, and he was also appointed to serve on the executive committee as their legal advisor. So as far as like Barfield's biography goes, that seems to be a really important aspect of the story of his life. And look, I know that issues like abortion are delicate, they're complex. People have very strong feelings about them, and I'm not unsympathetic to people who object to my views on the subject, which might happen to be very similar to Barfield's. But I am a little bit bothered by a few conversations I've had along the way with fellow Barfield enthusiasts who, because of their views on abortion, think that it'd be better if we just treat it as a regrettable footnote in his biography rather than emphasize its importance. I don't know. To me, it seems like this is very obviously, well, we're going to impoverish our understanding of Barfield if we overlook or underemphasize something that he regarded to be like a major ethical implication of his views. So when I say it's of more than historical and biographical importance, it's because I think Barfield's convictions about the intrinsic dignity of the individual and the infinite value of human life, and also his desire to promote an ethical and legal framework that supports that, I think that's a natural outgrowth of his broader worldview, and we could describe that worldview from various angles. We could say it was anti-reductionistic, we could say it was anthroposophical, we could say that it was Christian. All of these sort of coming together to inform this conviction, which motivated him to be a part of this and to take a public role in something very controversial. And so he did that, and I think it's interesting and worth noting, so I wrote a little paper on it just to highlight the importance of that.
Wonderful. I appreciate you bringing it to my attention. I feel like in hearing your description and in noting the historical fact of the matter, it would be an oversight to not include this element of Barfield's life. I mean, we're producing 12 episodes on his work with various scholars, and it has not come up other than in our correspondence. So, and like you, I am dedicated to preserving life and advancing the dignity of life at every stage. I'm curious if there's any connection between his anthroposophical worldview and his decision to become involved in, as they describe it, the first organization in the world to advocate against legalized abortion.
Yeah, so, I mean, the answer is yes, of course, there's an influence there. His worldview was so deeply anthroposophical that, I mean, I doubt any major decision he made in his adult life wasn't influenced by anthroposophy. But there is something I don't know, and this is actually something I want to find out. So if anybody listening has an answer for me, get in touch. I want to know if Rudolf Steiner himself expressed any convictions on abortion or any of the other issues that the SPUC was founded to address. Moreover, I don't really know if anthroposophists in general, if there's any kind of broad consensus among them about the ethical implications of Steiner's teaching in regard to these sorts of issues. I'm just not sure. I've asked around, I've tried to find out, and I haven't really gotten any solid answers. What I do know is this, that soon after the SPUC was founded, Barfield published a pretty lengthy letter to the editor of the Anthroposophical Quarterly, which was the main publication for anthroposophists in the English-speaking world. And they published it, but in it, he doesn't say, but he strongly suggests, or it's strongly implied, that most, if not all, of his readers would agree with him, or at least be sympathetic to the cause, the organization's work, the SPUC. So in that letter, he sums up his view by saying that it's not for one human being to decide, even on compassionate grounds, that another human being had better not live. Goes on to give his interpretation as a solicitor, as a legal scholar, his interpretation of the Abortion Act of 1967, which was the bill that was being proposed, which ended up being the impetus for the founding of the SPUC. So he was explaining it, he took it upon himself to explain the implications of it, or what he believed the implications to be, to his fellow anthroposophists. He notes that those in favor of that bill had long been organized, informed, and active, and he thought that anthroposophists, the anthroposophical community in England, could play a role in meeting that with some organization and becoming informed and active in opposing the bill. So these are his words. He says, because of this, he said, and because very few people are in the least aware of what is going on, or for that matter, of what abortion in practice involves in the way of discreetly suppressed horrors, the Society for the Protection of Unborn Children was formed. And then he ends the letter with a call to action, and he urges his fellow anthroposophists to write to their MPs and to join the SPUC. So, that letter, I don't know, it suggests to me that he didn't try to make the case that they should be sympathetic to the cause. He just tried to call them to action, give them the information that he thought that they needed. So anyways, if there's any anthroposophists out there who want to send me an email and give me their perspective on it, I'd be happy to. Because I would like to establish, to your question, how we can make explicit any kind of connection between an anthroposophical worldview and these particular ethical convictions. And that's the next step in that direction, I think.
Very good. Yeah, I would welcome any comments or inquiries to that point as well, because I'm curious, as you raised the connection to Steiner to this issue as well. And of course, abortion has been in existence perhaps forever, but it wasn't, I would imagine, Steiner was a bit older, so he might not have been sort of in the fray as Barfield was at that time.
Yeah, Steiner died when Barfield was a youngish man. Their lives intersected, but he was quite a bit older.
Yeah. My last question on this topic is, because it's an element of curiosity as well as perhaps controversy, but one of the elements of anthroposophical belief, as I understand it, is openness to the idea of reincarnation. And I'm curious about if there's any intersection with that concept and the SPUC.
Yeah, so I think so, and I'm not sure how to make that explicit, but let me try. It calls to mind an essay that Barfield wrote called The Coming Trauma of Materialism, and there's a line which I'll get to, which I think at least suggests the connection. And in that essay, Barfield predicts the eventual demise of what he calls the reigning reality principle in the West. That's what he elsewhere calls the paradigm of materialism, and by that he just means like the materialist or positivist philosophy, that whether it's consciously accepted by particular individuals in the West, he sees it as something that limits and conditions our imaginations, so that we perceive the world as if we're materialists, even if we reject a materialist philosophy. I think that's a really important aspect of Barfield's thought, that the ways our imaginations are conditioned such that certain beliefs become implausible to us, even if we have rational reasons for believing them. But anyways, he speculates about how the prevailing ethics of all Western societies are going to be transformed if this paradigm of materialism is finally transcended. And when, of course, he thought anthroposophists would play an important role in that cultural renewal. That's one reason why he was so interested in anthroposophy and active in the Anthroposophical Society. But then he asks this question, and this is from the essay. He says, "What will happen if it becomes as much a matter of common sense as the converse is now, that an individual human being is a unit of dignity, transcending birth and death, and not a lump of galvanized meat. So that idea of it transcending birth and death to me suggests he might have something like reincarnation in mind. Like a lot of Christians would say transcending death, that we have life that extends, beyond our earthly lives. But transcending birth, too, suggests more of the anthroposophical interpretation of Christianity that Barfield maintained. So the first view that we're units of dignity transcending birth and death, that's not limited to, but is certainly consistent with anthroposophical teaching. And I think that might be the beginnings of that connection. But Barfield didn't think that kind of transformation of our imaginations, which changes what we view as common sense, was going to happen until that paradigm of materialism was transcended on a cultural level.
Very interesting. And I presume that the transcendent aspect of the human spirit, and from the anthroposophical view of the evolution of our species, would be contingent on that soul or spirit being able to inhabit that period in that body that they inhabited, right, for that time period to continue the process.
Yeah.
Does that sound right?
Yeah, I think so. And in fact, I think you can view it as something that you would expect if you made an intelligent mixture of certain Eastern religions and Christianity, to where there is a certain kind of dignity conferred to the individual that if it's not unique to Judeo-Christian traditions, it's at least distinctive of them. And yet, if you combine these other elements, such as reincarnation that we might associate with Eastern religions, at least in that respect, they could be self-reinforcing. And I think that's something Barfield believed. I mean, I don't personally believe in reincarnation, but I can certainly see why that belief would reinforce his ethical convictions in regard to the dignity of human life.
Yeah, I get that. Well, thank you for unpacking a little bit about the SPUC and Barfield's role in founding and propagating that. Now we'd love to discuss the Great War between Barfield and Lewis. And as you pointed out, you were reading Lewis and working on Lewis with the imagination and realized you had to get into this Barfield guy. Yeah. I'm curious if you could give an overview of their main philosophical or spiritual or both sort of differences in this back and forth that they had regarding the imagination.
Yeah, sure. The Great War is, in one way it's simple, but in another way it's enormously complex. And it took a form, if you overhear a conversation between people that you don't know well, but who know each other really well, they have their own idiosyncratic ways of saying things and their own, inside jokes and things. And that's really the impression I get as I've tried to sort of dive into the Great War materials. And so, and they do deal with some fairly technical philosophical subjects. But let me back up. Let me just give an overview of the Great War and then we can talk about that. So when it began, they were young men. The Great War happened through most of the 1920s. And Lewis was still an atheist, at least at the beginning, and he was deeply suspicious of any claims about supernatural realities, religious or otherwise. And some of his own experiences gave him a really particular aversion to anything that could be described as occult. And so, for that reason, in his own words, he says he was hideously shocked when Barfield, whose intellect he respected more than any person of his acquaintance, Barfield embraced the teachings of Rudolf Steiner and joined the Anthroposophical Society, he and their other friend, Harwood. And he did not know what to do with that. He was shocked. He was a little bit disgusted. And fortunately, though, Lewis and Barfield had already bonded over their love of a good argument. And so instead of letting it hurt their friendship, they decided to have at it. And they continued to for like a decade almost. And so they argued and they argued. They carried it on in person, of course, when they couldn't be together. They were writing letters back and forth. They'd gather together for walking tours and walk around the English countryside and continue to argue about epistemology and the imagination and metaphysics and all these other issues. So again, that's also part of the difficulty in understanding the Great War, is that they had conversations that led up to the letters that they wrote, and then they had conversations between the letters that they wrote, and not all the documents are extant. It's a little bit difficult, but some of the materials are lighthearted and humorous. Some are long, dense, and technical, like philosophical treatises with grand Latin names and that sort of thing that they put in an envelope and sent in the mail. And some have silly drawings of stick figures that, they're being a little bit facetious but also trying to make a point. And others have intricate diagrams that are aimed at depicting the relation of matter and spirit, or subject and object. So it's fascinating stuff, but it's a little difficult to, wrap your mind around, just because this was their own, private discourse. They didn't imagine at that time that there would be any public interest in it. So they argued about everything. It's like metaphysics, epistemology, aesthetics, ethics, literary theory. But I don't know, the occasion for it was Barfield's embrace of anthroposophy. So that's, the sort of the fulcrum on which all these things turn. And then, moreover, if you had to identify like a central dispute, it would be about the nature and the function of the imagination and its relationship to truth. And in particular, when they talked about the imagination, they had these concrete experiences in mind. It's what Lewis describes as joy in his autobiography, if you're familiar with Surprised by Joy. It's this very particular experience that involves like a longing that's by its nature unsatisfiable, and that it would even be undesirable to satisfy, because it's the longing itself that he was longing for. And then Barfield had these similar experiences reading lyric poetry, where he felt like his whole consciousness was changed, and that it brought about this experience which he thought some kind of wisdom about the world. So that's how he opens up Poetic Diction, is explaining how he thinks poetry can bring about a felt change of consciousness, and how through that we gain a certain kind of wisdom. But for Lewis, he said, no, we're not gaining knowledge, we're not gaining wisdom. These experiences don't signify anything. They're pleasurable, they're valuable for that reason, but they're not going to lead us in the right direction. We shouldn't trust them as guides to truth about the world. And so that's maybe the center of their dispute.
Very interesting. What would Lewis have said then? Could we trust?
Well, it depends, because his mind changed over time.
Okay.
Barfield's mind didn't change so much. He got better at defending his views, but because Lewis was just dialectically a force to be reckoned with. Even at that age, he was very good at logical argument and dialectic. And that there's a quote, I highlighted it because I thought I might want to read it in a little bit. We'll get to it maybe, but that's what Barfield gained, is the ability to think more clearly and defend his views better. But Lewis actually changed his mind. And so in the beginning, like I said, Lewis was an atheist and he was a materialist, and then he's sort of like adopted it's like absolute idealism is how you might describe it in philosophical terms. And then he's sort of has these pantheistic tendencies. And then obviously the culmination of all this, and something the Great War played a large part in, is Lewis's conversion to theism. So he caught up to Barfield and then went a step further from where Barfield was at. And that, of course, was the most important step toward his conversion to Christianity. So Barfield played an important role in that. But as far as what Lewis said we should trust, he famously, I think it was in the 1930s, so it would have been after the Great War was over, he said that reason is the natural organ of truth. So it's through reason, and then also he would include revelation, because he says the natural organ of truth. There's the supernatural element, which is divine revelation. So between reason and revelation, that's how he thinks we can find the truth. And then he said, but the imagination is the natural organ of meaning. And meaning, something can be meaningful without being true. It can also be meaningful and be true, but it can't be true or false unless it's meaningful. And that's actually a conclusion that I think he came to during the Great War. Barfield convinced him that, at the very least, if you're not going to see the imagination as an organ of truth, you should see it as the organ of meaning. And Barfield did get Lewis to go that far, as that was one of the results of the Great War.
Thank you. I'm going to have to spend some time with Lewis on that one. My first blush is that's making a distinction without a difference. I don't know that anything can be true and not meaningful, or meaningful and not true, but that's another day.
Yeah.
Sorry, it caught me off guard.
Well, I told you at the beginning, I said this is complicated stuff. It takes time to I think really grasp what's going on in the Great War, and it's not easy to see how it all hangs together. And I'd like to be able to explain that. I'm not sure I can do that, but I'm hoping to do that at some point to write. I'd like to write a biography of Barfield, and that's something I'd like to do. There's some people who have done well. Even Thorson wrote a great book on the Great War. Recommend reading it. It's great. But I think that there's something to be said for presenting it in a way that emphasizes not only what happened, but how the various issues unfolded from the central contentions. To examine it philosophically, how these are all connected logically. I don't know. We'll see if I succeed. That's someday, hopefully, I can produce something that helps in that regard.
Oh, well, I'll be cheering you on. Easy for me to say. Would you say that there was a way that their differing views on the imagination influenced their writing?
Yes. Okay. So if we're talking about like their poetry and fiction, their imaginative writings, I think that the answer is probably, for the most part, no. So I think imagination, insofar as it's connected to literature, I think they were pretty much on the same page. And that's something that united them. Again, because they had these shared experiences, what Lewis called joy, and these sort of aesthetic experiences that Barfield describes in relation to poetry. They shared those in common, and for both of them, they weren't exclusively, but they were largely connected to their experiences with literature. And they were totally on the same page insofar as like the role of the imagination in the writing and well, maybe not totally on the same page, but largely on the same page. The writing and the appreciation of great literature. It's the broader philosophical implications of that was really the occasion for their dispute. So I'm going to put that forward with like a 80% degree of confidence that I don't think that as far as their imaginative writings go, I think what they agreed upon in regard to the imagination was sufficient to unite them in practice about the composition and appreciation of poetry and literature. I'm happy to be corrected on that if anybody wants to correct me. You can also send me an email. Anybody's welcome to send me an email. But it's the broader philosophical disputes, I think. Barfield thought, listen, we agree on this stuff. We've had these experiences. Now just look at what they mean. And what they mean is that you should accept this, that, and the other doctrine, mostly those taught by Rudolf Steiner. And Lewis said, not so fast. I'm not sure that really works. And so they argued about that for a long time.
Fascinating. Is there a link to be made between Barfield's interest in Romanticism and maybe even Anthroposophy and Lewis's interest in a more conventional approach to literature and philosophy?
Yeah. Again, Lewis changed a lot over time, and Barfield got better at what he did, but as far as his core of his thinking, remained pretty much the same. So the trouble with talking about Lewis is which Lewis and when. But I would say interest in Romanticism, for the most part, was something, at least in reference to literature, was something that Barfield and Lewis shared in common. But for Barfield, he had an interpretation of Romanticism that was maybe the source of their differences. He was fond of calling Rudolf Steiner's philosophy Romanticism come of age. So he thought the Romantics were onto something, but they just couldn't quite grasp. And then he thought Rudolf Steiner came to show us what that was. Lewis was not convinced of that, of course. So yeah, I mean, I don't think that they agreed insofar as they both had these sort of romantic tendencies, especially when it comes to literature. But the disagreement came on the interpretation of Romanticism and the relationship between the Romantics and Rudolf Steiner, whether, as Lewis thought, Steiner was doing something different and beyond what somebody like maybe Coleridge said, because they both loved Coleridge, both as a poet and a philosopher and a literary critic and theorist. But Barfield seemed to think Lewis was trying to have the aspects of Romanticism that he liked without following it to its logical conclusion. People can make up their minds as to who's right about that.
Yeah. Well, a couple of things stand out to me. First, as you keep describing Barfield's, I don't know the word conversion, but I mean, obviously we use that word so loosely, I think. His absolute conviction in Steiner's conceptions from his mid-20s or earlier, I'm trying to recall exactly, but it just steadfast in his devotion to these ideas. Do you have any insight to his personality or just his experience with Steiner that would lead to such a forceful belief?
Yeah. Okay. So I think Barfield describes the process, how he came to have this almost Damascus Road kind of experience where he says at first it was gradual. He was skeptical when he and his friend Harwood were taken by a friend of theirs to go see Steiner speak. But as soon as he got a good idea of what Steiner was all about, he said he realized that all of Barfield's most daring conclusion were Steiner's premises. And so for him, it's like he thought he was like this. He was out there doing something that nobody else really understood. Even his close friends like Lewis, he didn't feel quite understood why he believed the things that he did and why he thought they were so compelling. And to him, I think it was so refreshing and so surprising and so, well, it was just exciting for him to see, wait, all this stuff that I've been working so hard to articulate, this is his starting point. And then he takes it and runs with it. And so I think that experience for Barfield was a powerful impetus for him to form a really strong commitment to anthroposophy. And then as he matured in that commitment, I think it continually reinforced his conviction that he thought Steiner was, the most important thinker since Aristotle. And he really was convicted that he had a message that the world needed to hear. So, yeah, I don't know beyond that as far as I don't want to try to psychoanalyze Barfield or anything. I'm a little reticent to, because I didn't know him. I wish I did.
Understood. It does sound as though the experience was incredibly validating, which, would engender a tremendous amount of passion to continue in that vein. This isn't part of what I had proposed we entertain today, but I am curious, since you are so well versed, for those who are unfamiliar, what would be some elements of Steiner's work that would be a bridge too far for, say, Orthodox Christian or just typical Westerner?
Yeah, man. See, you put me on the spot because...
Sorry.
Well, I try to... Okay, yeah. So, obviously, you talked about reincarnation. You talked about, well, maybe we didn't talk about, but there are certain things about the interpretation of the person and work of Christ that, personally, I don't accept, nor do I reject. I don't reject them vehemently because I always leave room for the possibility that I haven't quite grasped everything that Steiner's up to. He is, whatever else can be said about him, he's deep, and he's, I've been continually surprised. I'm not an anthroposophist. I don't believe, very often I find myself agreeing more with Lewis, but I do so tentatively, and just because I have just such immense respect for Barfield, and I've learned so much from him. And that's part of what draws me to, why I'm focusing my studies on Barfield. I think for a reason that Lewis would approve of, is that it's the things that challenge us that should really, take most of our attention, the things that puzzle us or challenge us or make us a little bit uncomfortable. So yeah, I think the other thing to say is that anthroposophists, in my experience, have a lot of internal disagreements about what exactly it is that we really need to take from Steiner. And again, I know there's some pretty heated and passionate debates, and I don't want to, as somewhat of an outsider, I'm not trying to put a stake in the ground. I'm just doing my best to understand him because I want to better understand Barfield. But yeah, Barfield, he joined the Anglican Church, and he, I think, had a very sincere conviction. Some people question the sincerity of his convictions, that he was just doing it to please his wife and stuff. I've not come across any evidence for that in my reading. He seems in general to be a very sincere and straightforward person, and he he joined the Anglican Church, and I think had a sincere conviction that everything he believed and his interpretation of Steiner was entirely compatible with the thing that he was to declare in the process of becoming an Anglican. I think Lewis accepted that, and Lewis, over time, at first he was hideously shocked by anthroposophy, but over time he came to really respect he always respected Barfield and their friend Harwood and some others, anthroposophists in their circle, and he came to say, not only do I think that they're entirely rational people, but also, as far as I can tell, if he does something good for people's character, because these are some of the most respectable and virtuous people I know. So that's as much as I want to say about that.
Thank you. Thank you for indulging me on that
Yeah.
little rabbit trail. Back to Barfield and Lewis's Great War. Anything connected to the way they approached history and its interpretation?
Yes. There's a good essay collected in the book called Owen Barfield on C.S. Lewis, which collects the various talks and essays he wrote about Lewis, mostly after Lewis's death. And he talks about what he thinks is the main difference, the main persistent difference between him and Lewis. And that's their difference on historicism. Now, historicism in this context, at least, it signifies a belief in a meaningful historical process that can be discerned apart from a direct or divine revelation. And so Lewis wrote an essay where he said, I think it's just called Against Historicism, where he said, I reject any historicist interpretations of history, because he just doesn't think we know everything we would need to know to responsibly discern the meaning of history. And from Barfield's perspective, though Lewis had accepted a lot of the essential premises of the argument for the evolution of consciousness, which was the sort of historicist interpretation of history that Barfield offered. And yet he just wouldn't quite accept the conclusion. Now, again, you can have a debate about whether Barfield was right or whether Lewis was consistent and Barfield was missing something in Lewis's case against historicism. That's a discussion you can have, but the point is that there was this difference. And Lewis accepted what Tolkien is said to have called Barfield's theory of ancient semantic unity, which is this idea that the farther you trace words back into human history, the more you'll see unified meanings that combine material and immaterial meanings into one. So the most obvious classic example would be, you look at all these ancient languages, and you've got these words that signify soul, spirit, wind, and breath. And it's like, we might think, ancient people just were in the habit of using, one as a metaphor, the wind or breath as a metaphor for something immaterial and intangible. And Barfield said, actually, we have no reason to think that that's true. This really signifies a fundamental difference in their way, not only of thinking about the world, but of perceiving it and relating to it. That there was not this distinct line between the material and immaterial elements of ourselves or the world that we inhabit. And Lewis accepted that. He did accept that there was this sort of discernible process in history. And so you might think, well, then he and Barfield agree. But the crux of the disagreement would come in the anthroposophical interpretation of that. So, like I said, Steiner started where Barfield's conclusions were Steiner's premises, and that was like a premise, and then Steiner built upon that a whole theory of knowledge and this idea that we can have this super sensible awareness of higher worlds and that sort of thing. And that's where Lewis drew the line, as he said, well, yeah, we can see that this process has taken place, but do we see the meaning of the process? And Lewis said, no. And Barfield said, yes. So that was the difference in their thinking about history, and that played into their arguments.
Very interesting, yeah. And as I understand it, as you brought up the different words, breath, wind, spirit, the vision that Barfield had would be that there was a very keen awareness of one thing flowing into the other, and no distinction between, say, the Spirit of God and the wind that we felt in the trees. Is that correct?
Well, so in modern consciousness, we don't see a natural connection. We don't perceive a natural connection. But in the ancient world, Barfield said, there's all kinds of evidence in ancient language and literature that connection was just glaringly obvious to them.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's just a part of what Barfield, in Saving Appearances, calls modern idolatry. We just see the world as inert objects moving in accordance with the fixed laws of physics, and we don't see any meaning in or through the world that we perceive. But that meaning was the physical world was transparent to ancient people, and they were capable of seeing the sort of spiritual resonance of the material world. And that's really hard for us to do. But Barfield, again, just to talk about what attracted him to anthroposophy, he thought that Steiner put forward sort of a path by which we could recover what's been lost in the evolution of human consciousness, recover that awareness of the spiritual resonance of the material world. And so reading lyric poetry was one way, but Steiner's was a more like systematic and thorough way of regaining that awareness. And that's again, he wanted that. Not that he wanted us just to go back to the consciousness of ancient people. He thought we gained some things in the process of losing some things, but he wanted to recover what had been lost without losing what had been gained.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one of the things, and again, this is all introductory for me with respect to Barfield, but one of the concepts that really resonates with me of his is sort of the reintegration of final participation, not a nostalgia for a more primitive time and a dismissal of, our development as humans in the interim, but a reconnecting all the dots and even a greater transcendent experience to come.
Yeah, it's like the Hegelian dialectic. There's the thesis, the antithesis, which is modern idolatry, but the hope is that there'll be a synthesis, not going back to the thesis.
Yeah.
I saw your conversation with Max Leyf, and I thought it was interesting. You talked about the different temperaments and how we all probably have some kind of tendency to either look back nostalgically on the past or into the future, and that Barfield was rightly trying to keep a delicate balance of not falling into a hopeless nostalgia for the past, but also not discounting the importance of what needs to be recovered and brought forward from the past into the future. And I think you said you're a forward looker.
Yes.
I am definitely temperamentally a backward looker. It's the past.
Thanks for meeting me in the middle here today. Yeah, Matt, I had a great conversation with Max, as all of these have been. I'm so grateful to each of you for your generosity of time, and because it's not just the time that we're having our conversation, but it is countless hours that you all have devoted to study. As you describe, still so much more to be cultivated and transmitted. In particular, my hope is that these conversations would be a little more accessible than the academy, because at the end of the day, I'm not too inclined to, 8 scholars sitting around debating by themselves. I want to get more higher thinking in the mainstream if I can.
Yeah.
I appreciate it. What would you say, if there is any evidence, that the Great War shaped their individual careers?
Yeah. I mean, for Lewis, it's obvious, because the Great War played such an important role in leading him to the point where he was ready to be converted to Christianity. And when people think of Lewis, they think of this deeply and thoroughly Christian writer. And of course, without the Great War, we have no reason to suppose he would have ever become that which he's valued rightly for being, or for having become. For Barfield, again, I think it comes back to Lewis gave him some of the tools he needed to take these profound and brilliant ideas he had and express them in a philosophically defensible way. That's what Lewis gave to him. Here's the quote. I was going to read this earlier. Lewis talks about how he was changed, and Barfield says, well, I didn't change my mind so much, but just because I didn't change my mind, it doesn't mean I wasn't transformed by these arguments. These are Barfield's words. He says, the argument between us went into all sorts of philosophical and psychological detail. And I remember getting into very hot water on one occasion after trying to maintain that a proposition might be true from one point of view and untrue from another. In these arguments, Lewis could always knock me down, and not with much difficulty. And I learned more than I can say from those falls. So that's what the primary thing Barfield gained out of it, is getting knocked down enough to learn what he needed to in order to become such a powerful exponent of these ideas, these convictions that he believed.
That's great.
I mean, I guess the other thing, we could mention the two things that Lewis said that he got most out of the Great War, the ways that he was transformed apart from, being sort of prepared for the moment of conversion. One of them is, he said, Barfield taught me, let's see, I have it right here, let me read it. Barfield made short work of what I have called my chronological snobbery, and by this he meant the uncritical acceptance of the intellectual climate common to our own age, and the assumption that whatever has gone out of date is on that account discredited. So at one point, when Lewis first heard about anthroposophy, his response was, I can't believe they believe this. It's medieval, because it's, spirits and all these things. And he styled himself at that time as, a modern and a sophisticated. He believed in the material world, and he believed in science and all this stuff. And then they're over here talking about like the, higher spiritual world of spirits, and he said it's medieval. But what that revealed is that a lot of what gave him confidence in his own views was simply that they were contemporary, and that he could look to the smart people walking around Oxford University who thought that all this stuff is obviously true. And then he contended with Barfield and learned, okay, the man of all people whose intellect I respect the most, or at least of all his friends, does not see this stuff in any way as obvious, and indeed believes things that I think are absurd. So what he learned is I can't just appeal to the fact that an idea has gone out of fashion in order to refute it. I've got to do some more work. And there was that. And then he also, one more quote, he said that he had to give up his materialism as a result of Barfield's arguments, and he had to admit that, quote, mind was no late-come epiphenomenon, and that the whole universe was at the last resort mental, that our logic was a participation in a cosmic logos. That would take some time to unpack. If you've read Lewis's book Miracles, he does unpack that, and so that'd be the place to go if you want Lewis's perspective on that.
That's fascinating. One of the things that stood out to me in my conversation with Barfield's grandson with the same name, he had mentioned that, towards the end of their relationship, that Tolkien and Lewis weren't particularly close. And one of the things that, you described growing up, I presume, in a Christian environment, I had likewise. And Lewis and Tolkien are kind of these fixtures of the most known Inklings. Obviously, Narnia and Lord of the Rings, highly influential and well regarded. And one of the things that I'm curious about is that, they had their relationship clearly, but Barfield and Lewis, who seemed to have more that they disagreed on, had a much closer bond, and their friendship continued to the very end. And I wonder if you would speak to their friendship and how the Great War perhaps reinforced it rather than caused them to part ways.
Yeah, sure. Regarding, Tolkien and Lewis, their friendship definitely cooled. Tolkien made some, I'd say unsavory remarks about some of Lewis's later works. I don't know a lot of the details about, how they would each characterize their friendship by the end of Lewis's life. I think they were certainly still friends, and I know that there's at least some evidence that Tolkien was really grieved a lot when he heard the news of Lewis's death. He said something like, when you grow older, the leaves fall off your tree, but this is like an axe to the roots upon receiving the news of Lewis's death. So they still, cared very much for each other, but it's completely true that over time, their friendship, and there was a little bit of antagonism, at least in one direction. For Barfield and Lewis, Lewis's friendship with Barfield, we know because Barfield said it explicitly that Lewis was the most important friendship of his life, reflecting near the end of his life when asked who was, the most important of all your friends, of all your friendships. And he said it was C.S. Lewis. And lots of evidence to say that Lewis felt the same. It's not necessarily true, though, that there wasn't any negative impact on the relationship as a result of the Great War. It did, having an occasion for arguing did strengthen their relationship because they loved to argue. And I share that with them. Anybody who wants to sit around and argue, you can come to my house anytime you want. I'm ready for it.
An open invitation to argue with Landon.
Yeah, so I love a good argument, but there was a point after Lewis's conversion he didn't really want to carry the argument on any further, and there's a lot of mystery here. I don't think we know exactly what Lewis felt or thought that made him, at least according to Barfield's accounts, very averse to picking up the threads of the argument after his conversion. And in fact, there's a story that Barfield told about when they went on a walking tour together, because of course after the Great War they continued to be friends, they got together, they just didn't talk about these kinds of things. They went on a walking tour and Barfield thought, let's get back to it. Let's see if we can cover some more ground. And Lewis, according to Barfield, he turned to him and said, no, I can't bear it. And then didn't follow up, and Barfield was kind of hurt and confused and didn't know why Lewis didn't want to continue these conversations. And he said at that point there was something that felt broken. Again, they continued to be very close friends. They gathered together regularly to go on walking tours, and they liked to get together and read great works of literature aloud together. And so they continued to be very close friends. But at least on Barfield's side, there was a little bit of hurt feelings about this sort of abrupt end to those conversations, which Barfield had enjoyed and benefited from. And also, I think he had a sincere desire. I mean, it was his conviction that Anthroposophy was not just his private interest, but something he wanted to share with others, and he wanted to share it with his friend. But Lewis, I think, pretty clearly put up a wall at that point and said, we had that conversation, and he was done with it. And, fair enough, but I can also see why Barfield was a little bit hurt by that.
Yeah. Well, my final question was going to be if there was a resolution to the Great War, but it sounds like it was just a one-sided armistice.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there was a resolution in the sense, you could almost view Lewis's conversion not as a resolution, but a culmination of that in conjunction with some other influences and causes. But that's, from Barfield's perspective, it felt unresolved.
Well, I've had a great time, Landon. Do you have any final thoughts regarding Barfield on these topics?
No, I think I've said everything I know about it.
Well, good. Thank you again for
appreciate you having me
being
on.
a part of this.
Yeah. All right.
Today's episode of The Plunge is sponsored by the word station, S-T-A-T-I-O-N, station. It's Good Friday, and a key element of most Good Friday services throughout history is what is known as the Stations of the Cross, an observance of the different scenes that occurred the night Jesus Christ was betrayed, surrendered, tried, found guilty, and ultimately executed in a gruesome fashion on a hill called Golgotha over 2,000 years ago. The word station has multiple meanings. It can refer to a stopping place for transportation. It can also be a building or an area where transportation stops, like a bus station. That's probably the most common usage, the one you're probably most familiar with. Additionally, it can describe a place or position where someone or something is assigned to work or be located, such as a radio station, if those still exist. A couple of other examples of the use of the word station would be for position or social status. A person's particular rank in a society could be referred to as their station. And lastly, as we reflect on what this day means for those who are followers of Jesus, a station means a place of duty. It can refer to where a person is assigned to stand and to serve. As Good Friday reminds us, Jesus stood and served wherever he was, in every context, from the beginning of his ministry, and I would imagine from the beginning of his life, to the very end. His death itself was the ultimate standing, the ultimate place of duty, the ultimate and highest role of service, to take the wrath of the world, the vengeance of men, and rather than return violence for violence, he absorbed it all within himself. And among his last words were these: while being nailed to a cross, "Forgive them, Father. They don't know what they're doing." A very, very challenging example for us to follow in the world today. May we be able to forgive as Jesus did. And may we stand in our stations, whatever they may be, at home, at work, in the community, at play, to be fully engaged and to serve. Thank you, Station, for sponsoring today's episode of The Plunge.